Professor Staffan Lindberg and Dr. Marina Nord, thank you so very much for joining our interview. So I want to start right away with the first question. Professor Stephen Levitsky, in his article, Democracy's Surprising Resilience, argues that the data does not support your findings in V-Dem, the project's 2023 report. He writes, and I quote, "The Varieties of Democracy Project's 2023 report claimed that global levels of democracy had declined to 1986 levels, and thus the global democratic advances of the last 35 years had been wiped out." End of the quote. What is your response to Professor Levitsky's assessment, Professor Lindberg?
That the data supports that. It's just
the data supports that.
Yeah, of course. Otherwise, we wouldn't publish it. One should note that this is a quote of our calculations based on the population-weighted data. So it gives more weight to large countries with large populations. The reason for that is that if we talk about how much democracy there is in the world, the country weighted averages only looks at, sort of gives equal weight to any territory that has a government. So that the Seychelles with 90,000 inhabitants get the same weight as India with 1.4 billion people. And that's fine for certain purposes, of course. But in terms of how much democracy there is in the world, we think that it means a little more for the world if democracy declines in India with 1.4 billion people affected than if, as it has been now, democracy going up in the Seychelles with 90,000 inhabitants. By the population weighted measure, the average is back to 1986. I don't know if you want to add anything, Marina, to what I just said.
Well, I would just add that even if you look at country averages, you still see a decline. The decline is not that magnificent, of course. It goes back to 1997, if I remember it correctly, but there is still a decline.
All right. Professor Levitsky highlights democracy's surprising resilience all over the world, which is exactly the opposite of your findings in 2023 Democracy Report. How do you explain the two very different findings?
They're not necessarily too different. I think you have to be honest with that there are a number of countries in the world that today are much better in terms of democracy than they were in 1989. Large portions of Eastern Europe, parts of Latin America and Africa are much better, to just give some examples. But there are also a number of countries in the world where things have gotten worse and much worse. So you can still have some countries that democratized during what Stephen referred to as the third wave of democratization, and most of the literature does, that are today sort of resilient, or at least have stabilized and at a certain level of democracy. And yet the global average declines because other countries have been declining. So the two things are not mutually exclusive.
Dr. Nord?
Yeah, I would say that if you think about democracy, survival of democracy only as the existence of contested elections, then of course, like in many countries, elections are still in place. However, the quality of elections and then all other attributes, additional attributes that go into democracy, such as freedom of speech, freedom of association, that is what is declining, and this is surprising. So resilience, yes, as survival of elections as such, but like, so I don't see that like those are two different findings.
All right. Okay. In his article, Democracy's Surprising Resilience, Professor Levitsky further argues that, and I quote, thus, even if Freedom House and V-Dem are correct in identifying an increase in the incumbent abuse over the last decade or so, the consequences of that abuse appear to be modest, for many autocratic leaning incumbents are failing to entrench themselves in power. How would you comment on this judgment, Professor Lindberg?
Well, I think if you ask serious observers of Turkey, of Hungary, and so on, I think one doesn't necessarily agree. And many is a very flexible term. We have seen, yes, a few cases of countries where autocratizing incumbents have been defeated, thrown out of power. Just very recently in Poland, although the transition is still ongoing, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the United States. We also saw turnarounds in Zambia recently. There was a downward period in South Korea that was also turned around. So there are a number of important cases where the autocratizing incumbents have failed. But there are, by at least our data, and Freedom House, I think, would concur with that, many more countries where the autocratizing parties and leaders have continued to derail democracy, and in many cases done away with democracy. So that's the more general trend that we see in the world, rather than that a few incumbents fail at turning democracy into autocracy.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Nord?
I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In your article, A Third Wave of Autocratization is Here, What is New About It, which you wrote together with Anna Lurman, you argue that any wave of autocratization is unfolding. The article was published in 2019. Do you still agree with the finding?
No. So we started working on that back in 2016, 17, and eventually it was published in 19. And at that time, we saw this third wave of autocratization, that it had started, that it was there, it was still unfolding. Let me correct myself. I think it's still unfolding, but I think we tried to be, and it's gotten worse. So in our follow-up work on waves of autocratization, and also the work we do with the Democracy Report, that wave has become much worse. In that article, we had, I think, if I remember correctly, a maximum number of countries autocratizing at the same time. That was 28. Mm-hmm. By our count, in the last year's Democracy Report that Marina here was also part of working with, we counted 42. Mm-hmm. That's a significant increase. What right. I do not sort of concur with in that article is that we said that it's sort of there is no reason to panic or something like that.
Exactly. That's the next question. Yeah. You said it was premature to announce the end of history in 1992. It's premature to proclaim the end of democracy now. You argue that democracy is in decline, but it's no reason to panic.
Yeah, I mean,
so it seems that you agree with Professor Levitsky.
No, I hope that it's too early to announce the end of democracy, if you like, in the world. I do think, and that's where I'm in a different position today than I think Anna and I were back then in 2018, before this article came out. I think there is reason to, if not panic, that's a bad reaction maybe, but to be very, very concerned. And here I and many, many others, and I will let Marina speak for herself, but feel that what Stephen, Professor Levitsky, and some other commentators are doing when they are sort of saying that not much is changing, is a disservice to the world. But what I see in our data, what I see in news reporting every day, is democracy under attack in so many places, including now my own country, Sweden, right, where there are beginning signs with another far right, extreme, anti-pluralist party, that are forcing our current government, if you like, to take the first steps in what could become an episode of autocratization. That's very worrying when that starts happening, sort of established old democracies. So yes, if not panic, and I don't think one should panic, be very, very concerned and very worried.
Dr. Nord, would you like to join the discussion?
I would agree with the claim that panic would be the wrong word here, but to be worried, yes. Just to give you some numbers, right now, according to the latest data that we have from 2022, 43% of the world population live in autocratizing countries. And this is what we see as a global trend. And what is notable is that, like, not only democratic countries such as Brazil, Ghana, or Greece are autocratizing, but also some already autocratic countries become furthermore autocratic, like Hungary, India, Philippines, Russia. I mean, with Russia, we saw that that was already like pretty much a stable autocracy, but they managed like to get even further in autocratization, and this is the reason to be concerned. So I would say not panic, but to take action. It's time to take action, to pay attention to this.
Right, right. One of the findings of the Democracy Report 2023 by V-Dem is that the global advances of democracy achieved in the last 35 years has been wiped out. The level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2022 is down to 1986 levels. How do you explain the dynamics of this downfall? What went wrong?
Yeah, I think that's what is it called these days? The $1 billion question, right? I don't think we have an answer. I think the answer is probably also very complex, several forces at the same time. In a lot of countries and regions of the world, there are also local dynamics that play into this. But the fact that it is a global wave, and it is truly global, we register this in every region of the world. There are countries autocratizing at very different levels of socioeconomic development, different sort of ethnic, linguistic, social identity configurations, both countries with dominant groups or sort of very homogeneous countries to very heterogeneous, different levels of economic development, different levels of democracy to begin with. So it's a very diverse set of countries that are now autocratizing, and that suggests that there are also some global forces at play. We know about some of them. For example, Russia, and indeed the third wave of autocratization, when it sort of started to pick up speed the last few years of the 1990s and early 2000s. Part of that was basically Putin in Russia, turning things around in Russia, and then affecting many of the former Soviet republics. we see some outgrowth of that now, of course, with the illegal invasion of Ukraine. We also know about China, and then, yeah, we can add Putin's and his troll fabrics outside of St. Petersburg and involvement in Brexit and American elections, and their involvement with essentially every far-right extremist party and groups across Europe. Those links are well known. Then we have China. We know about China. China has been, especially since the mid-90s, pushing back at the sort of democratic wave in very many different ways and across the established democracies, but also in the global south. And let's not forget about Saudi Arabia. They have been doing the similar thing, supporting anti-democratic Salafist movements. And Salafism used to be this microscopic little part of the Muslim world, and it's no longer. Iran, of course, is another player on that side. And you can, I mean, this, of course, there are many versions of Islam, practicing Islam that are compatible with human rights and democracy and women's rights and so on. Salafism is not, right? So it's very simple. Then there is a lot of research being done, and I think an increasing amount of evidence that point in the direction that this enormous increase in relative economic inequality that also started long ago, back in the 80s, and has spread across the world to virtually all countries, is also a breeding ground for these wannabe dictators to patronize on that dissatisfaction and fear for the future that often follows inequalities. We don't have a sort of solid scientific consensus with many studies that can certify that that's the case, but I think increasingly a lot of evidence point in that direction, and it makes a lot of intuitive sense. It also makes historical sense if you go back to the 1930s and what happened then. So those are some of the drivers I'm thinking of. I don't know which ones you're thinking of, Marina, or if you want to add something here.
I would agree that in each case there is something context specific, but I would say the general explanation would be something like there is a growing discontent with democracy as a regime, and then in each case it may be either inequality or an economic crisis or migration or something very country specific, and then those discontent leads to movements, and that can channel those waves of populism, and this is how wannabe dictators come to power in democracies. And then once they're in power, they start to gradually undermine elections. And I would also point that compared to historical examples, what's very different with contemporary autocratization is that it is often a gradual process, so it doesn't happen overnight in most cases. And it also often happens under legal facade. So this, what right now is called a democratic backsliding or democratic erosion. So it's kind of, right now it's a process when a country becomes substantially less democratic.
Right. In V-Dem's Democracy Report 2023, you underlined that democracy broke down in 7 of the top 10 autocratizing countries in the last 10 years: El Salvador, Hungary, India, Serbia, Thailand, Turkey, and Tunisia. What do you mean exactly by democratic breakdown? Because, for example, in Turkey, elections are still held and the parliament is open and it keeps legislating.
Yeah, and the same is the case. You could say the same thing for Russia. Just because you hold multi-party elections on paper and you have a legislature that stamps legislation, doesn't mean you have democracy, right? We demand more from democracy for a country to be a democracy than just that. And this was called already back in the 1990s by Tom Carothers and others as the electoral fallacy, right? Don't equate democracy with holding multi-party elections.
Mm.
So democracy requires more. And first of all, you require that those elections are actually free and fair and periodic. But even if they are sort of reasonably free and fair, we also require that opposition parties between elections are not being harassed, oppressed, muscled, prosecuted for political reasons, and so on.
Mm.
And even beyond that, in order for people to make informed choices at elections, we also require that the freedom of speech, more generally, in terms of media and individual freedom of speech, is also reasonably free. So you cannot have, as you have the situation in Hungary since around 2018, when Orban and his clientele around Fidesz control 98% of the media. Then you no longer have a freedom of speech environment, right? Even if individuals on the street can, in principle, say whatever they want and nobody cares. But then you have a media regime that can be used by the people in power to make people believe whatever. For example, in Hungary, the government loyal press, which constitute 98%, have pushed the story that Putin was forced by NATO to invade Ukraine, and therefore Russia's invasion was legitimate. And a lot of people in Hungary believe that, right? Not as a result of freedom of speech. And then you can have sort of on paper free and fair elections, but if that's the environment for discussing what is the government is doing and so on and so forth, people are not going to be able to make informed, independent choices at the ballot box. And of course, you need to have free civil society that can also opinionate, demonstrate, voice their critique of the regime, and so on, which is impossible in Turkey, for example, right? And a lot of the leaders have been thrown into jail or harassed and so on. Same for academics, by the way. So the just holding elections and having a legislature that issues legislation doesn't a democracy make.
Mhm.
I would just add here one point,
Please.
just again, like some numbers on that. I mean, right now in the world, there are only 6 countries that do not hold elections. So, like, democracy is more than elections. And then, just to remind, there were also regular elections in the Soviet Union, but they were meaningless. So, the presence of election doesn't automatically make you a democracy.
All right. Many pundits argue that upcoming European Parliament elections in June 2024 will witness a surge of far-right populist parties. How concerned are you about a possible victory of far-right parties, Professor Lindberg?
Very concerned.
Mm.
I think everyone should be. We have shown in a number of publications, also using the varieties of parties and party organization data set, which is separate from the regular V-Dem data set, but with data on individual parties, that it is far-right extremist parties that are not only populist, but they are anti-pluralist. their rhetoric and policies, that when they come into power, they are the ones in the current wave of autocratization that typically drive those processes. There are a few instances of left-wing parties and leaders that have also autocratized recently, but they're very few and far between in comparison to the vast majority that are driven by these right-wing. So yes, I would be very concerned if that also translates into and is materializes in the European Parliament elections.
All right. Dr. Nord?
I would agree.
All right. Leaders like Erdogan and Orban, who deviate from democracy and veer towards authoritarianism, often claim that they have not strayed from democracy, rule of law, human rights, and freedoms. They even argue that they are models for other aspiring democracies. They defend these claims by arguing that they have embraced a form of democracy tailored to their country's sociocultural characteristics. What is your response to the claim that beyond the democratic systems with universal values and forms we are familiar with, there can be different forms of democracies adapted to each country and culture?
Yes, of course. We already see that among the established democracies. It's been very different the way democracy has functioned in the United States since they got a really good democracy or good democracy in around 1970 and not before. Very different from France, and France is very different from Sweden in many ways. And in Ghana, it's also functioned different. It's a culture, different cultural background, and so on. Or in Chile, we can go down the line. Of course, that doesn't mean that any version of that some leader proclaim is democracy is a democracy. China also claims that they are actually, the last white paper they put out on that, the only democracy that works in the world. That was a white paper they issued after the first democracy summit that the Biden administration put together. You know, Orban's claim to have or want to have an illiberal democracy, that's an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. A democracy cannot be illiberal because the founding principle of liberalism is the reciprocal acceptance and tolerance of opposing views. If you're illiberal, you don't accept the opposing views. That's not compatible with democracy. Now, Orban tries to frame this in terms of sort of LGBTQI rights and women's and conservative family values and all that. But that's just a framing. The real politics is about eradication of opposing views and opposing political forces. And that's not compatible with democracy.
All right.
Yeah, I would just add that I have heard several times in Russian political circles that Russia is called as a guided democracy, and that also contradicts this definition of democracy that we have.
Right, right. And lastly, I want to talk about this the latest report by International IDEA that was published last week. The report found that almost half the countries have suffered a notable decline, and it says what may be worse is that it is the 6th consecutive year in which countries with net declines outnumbers those with net advances, the longest such pattern in our database. Are you surprised with the finding, Professor Lindberg, or it just confirms or vindicates your position?
Well, it tallies very much with our democracy report, and it's no surprise because most of their data that they use comes from us. It used to be 70%. I don't know what the latest figure is, but the International Ideas report on the global state of democracy has always been mainly based on V-Dem data. So that their report that comes out 9 months after ours shows very much the same pattern as our democracy report is no surprise.
Right. And where does this trend end? Do you foresee any possible scenario?
Now we're not really in a position to make predictions. We can just speak of the facts as they stand, and the fact of the matter is that the number of countries that are autocratizing has been in steep decline over the last few years, and we haven't seen that curve bending over yet, and that is the worrying fact that we should all be reacting to.
Professor Lindberg, Dr. Nord, thank you so very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. All the best.
You too.